Hello, everybody. And thank you, Yuri, for organizing this very inspiring conference that I had the honor of presenting on all of them. The second one, that is now. And the talkers before me have been very inspiring, and I see there's quite a few connections there. So I hope that we will see them as well. So my research is situated in the discourse of digital architecture and prefabrication. So with this presentation, I would like to introduce to you some of the ideas and concepts that have risen from it, and maybe also somehow relate them to the idea of innovation. The title of the presentation, From Purification to Hybridization, is of course inspired by Bruno Latour's We've Never Been Modern. So this talk is divided into two parts. The first half is more theoretical and talks about purification, and then the second half explains our research here at PUC and some of the ideas that came out of my thesis. So, purification. One of the main concerns in prefabrication is how we break buildings down to components, how we make parts out of wholes. We could also say how to disassemble objects so that the reassembly becomes easy, which is the basis of the analytical method. So we need to find somehow elements. And elements, as we first of all know in chemistry, are the basic building blocks of matter. But you could still go on further and divide them into protons and electrons, etc., until at one point we arrive at energy. But talking about material processes, energy might not be the most efficient way of explaining them. So there needs to be a level of productivity within how we divide wholes into elements. And one of the most prominent recent examples of looking for elements in architecture was the 2014 Architecture Biennale curated by Rem Koolhaas, where he was in the main exhibition looking at architectural elements, actual pieces of architecture that already contain meaning in them. But the type of elements that I'm interested in that start to become productive need to be on a more abstract level. Elements that are not yet architecture. So when we construct virtual worlds, we construct them with geometry. So first of all, there needs to be a geometric system, so geometric elements. But there's also materials to consider. There's structural calculations and models to consider, and everything else that we could think of that influences the way we build up the world of objects that could influence it. But let's start from the beginning. So my work has been influenced through looking at the history of architecture and how elements have been defined. Also with with the idea of digitalization in the back of my head. The first example of this is, of course, Durand, who in the beginning of the 19th century, in the spirit of the analytical method, started to break architecture down into elements and finding the basic methods and devising what he called the procedure to be followed in the composition of any project. And what he did, he was teaching engineers, but had been taught himself by the masters of early modern architecture. So he wanted to somehow bring this symbolic meaning of architecture embedded into a method that could be transferred easily. So basically he created first platform of what we today call integrated design, where actually people from different backgrounds can take part in the design process. So coming up with this almost pixel-like regular grids and how architectural elements could relate to them, and also creating catalogs of elements. And this was such a radical innovation that his contemporaries saw this as the killing of the soul of architecture, which meant that this kind of method wasn't really used in a general terms until over 100 years later, and then already influenced by new ideas about open systems and general system theory. So this example is of Konrad Waxman and Walter Gropius' general panel system, where we again have this idea of creating completely standardized symmetric elements that could easily be reconfigured into any project. And to illustrate this, they also hired architects to design with their system, which is a tendency that we see today. Again, we actually have an ongoing competition for kindergartens in Estonia based on one of the building systems developed here at the Estonian Academy of Art, PAK, our Timber Architecture Research Center. But Waxman also took this idea into three-dimensional space and started creating modular systems in 3 dimensions. But what I find even more interesting is the way Fuller actually created a completely symmetrical system. One could say it's a voxel-based system for creating architecture in the 1960s. So now there's no more differentiation between building elements. There's just structure that can become floors, walls, and ceilings. And the same idea was picked up by Joona Friedman and his colleague Eckhard Schulze-Fielitz, where they started to think about how these structures could actually take over whole cities, and most importantly, how these structures could start to self-organize through its inhabitants. So there's a part of standardized elements that can be reconfigured. so that we wouldn't have to demolish buildings and try and find how to reuse them, but actually build the buildings already in a way that foresees this happening. So how does this relate to the digital? In talking about the digital and digitalization, we also need to understand the difference between digitization, which is turning analog information into a digital format, and the actual process of digitalization, which is organizing the way we inhabit the world in order to cope with digital tools. So basically the cultural practices that that enable us to use more and more digital tools and to be infiltrated by them, and who knows where this is going. But digital computation, as Mario Carpo and also Jüri Soolep have pointed out, is starting, one could say, in the 15th century with Brunelleschi and Alberti, later developing a notational system for the delivery of buildings. And this is where we come back to the elements. So the alphabet is again this system of basic elements that lets us create almost anything. So it's a very productive kind of element. And coming to the digital world, these lost my thought there. Everything can be seen as code. So when we translate, when we digitize analog information, it becomes a digital object. And digital objects are basically code and data, which makes them responsive. So all digital objects can respond to each other. And this is what creates a flat ontology. Basically, we can look at structure, at material, at geometry in a similar way and interchange them. And what we perceive as different objects in the digital might actually be exactly the same. As Greg Lynn was saying in the 90s, that a sphere is just a low information blob. It just doesn't have more information than this one point. Or if we look at the Voronoi diagram, much overused by the first generation of digital architects, we can also see that there's no difference between a square and a hexagon, and they're in this sense interchangeable. And this flat ontology means that we can create a system of digital objects interacting with each other for architecture. The only thing is we need to decide what those objects are. And when the first generation was dealing more with the digital and less with how to produce it, kind of postponing the actual fabrication part, then more and more, as was also pointed out by the previous presenter, we're seeing discrete assemblies coming out of these digital workflows. And talking about the aesthetics of this kind of newer digital objects, we see that there's actually, again, a long history in this aesthetics. So this is an artwork from 1966 by Frieder Nake that is based on Max Benz, or that creates the generative aesthetics that Max Benz describes as bringing about orderly arrangements by the careful planning together with chance. So now we don't anymore have to design by knowing where we're going. We can also create a system of those digital objects and see where they lead us, and design by saying what if or maybe. And this kind of aesthetics is currently very much used by this young generation of architects that can be called the computational brutalists. Which brings us to hybridization. So I mentioned already Eckhard Schulze-Felix, and I really enjoy his idea of the spatial structure, or Raumstruktur, as it's called in German, which is the way in which space is organized through natural and social processes. So based on how we define the elements that we use, the technologies that we use, and how we put them together, a kind of pattern emerges. And this creates a system of analysis and synthesis happening simultaneously. So we have a computational model where we actually see what happens if we change the element, or if we change the relationships between elements, and how this Raumstruktur in design could then direct us not into post-rationalizing our designs, but actually creating designs that are pre-rationalized. Instead of crumpling paper with crumpled polygons, we already produce what is producible, not vice versa. And the implications of this in fabrication, for the first one, you would have a lot of waste material if you would actually want to scale it up into something architectural scaled, whereas the other is in essence consists of completely standardized elements. So through these examples and analytical method, system theory, and eventually flat ontology, I have derived a design method that tries to bring together the conditioning circumstances that the spatial structure is based on, with subjective decision making, the design process. So creating an algorithm that already takes the preconditions into account, and can be fed with further ones, we can manipulate those systems to create different kind of structures. And how am I on time? So, first of all, for the structure to work, it needs to be space filling. But there's we can divide space repetitively with regular elements, but also repetitively with irregular elements, or irregularly with regular shapes, using simple computational algorithms to create the grid system that in Durand's case was a square projection on the plan. Now could be something more complex. And to round this Raumstruktur topic up, I would like to show actually something completely different that works on the same principles. So this pylon designed in our office is based on a simple structural system. It's a decision made in the beginning to have the least amount of elements that is possible to construct it, which is 4 lines, so that it can stand up and hold up all the lines. And then, together with the engineers Bollinger and Grohmann, we fed the model with all the geometric constraints, the structural constraints, and we made the pylon dance. There's a video coming up. But again, there's a modular logic. They're not standardized repetitive parts, but there are geometrically very rigorous elements. There are the conic linear elements, and then the blends that actually create the architectural image. And yeah, so putting all those things together into the evolutionary solver to find the least amount of material to be able to carry those lines, this is what comes out. And it's interesting to note that our first reaction, because they're different pylons. One is on a corner, so it needs to react to forces completely differently than the other one that is on a straight line. And also it didn't need this extra arm. But it turned out, because it's so slender, it needed an extra leg. So this kind of things you don't come up with yourself if you think of how the structure works, but making it dance, all of a sudden these creatures start to emerge, which is to me quite fascinating, and brings about the part of or the quality of these systems that I think is most closely connected to innovation, which is the emergent otherness of those computational systems. So this is a scheme of how basically this thing has developed. We started out by thinking of how we can create structures modularly. So we come up with an element. Then we start assembling those elements and see what kind of structures they create. and by allowing transformations in the assembly of the elements, at one point some kind of patterns start to emerge. And in a way you could call this a geometric search engine. You don't really know where you're going, but like gradually you find structures and proportions and symmetries and rhythms that start resonating. And later on, we realized this structure has a relation to truncated dodecahedrons, which are space-filling, dividing them to further smaller elements that have more symmetry, tetrahedrons and octahedrons, etc. And then starting to combine them again. So not staying with the granular elements, but then seeing how can we create a family of components out of those grid cells. And these were one of the few first tests to kind of visualize those ideas. These are undulating surfaces that are treated with this algorithm. So the research at PAC that we're doing, we also did a bus stop. A timber manufacturer came to us with the problem that they have a lot of leftovers from CLT plates, namely those windows and doors. And they're mainly quite the same size because doors are similar. So we used the same kind of method and system to create elements out of the doors by introducing a diagonal cut and then recombining those elements. We actually created a geometric system that goes beyond the orthogonal and has a lot more spatial freedom. So this was sent to their factory, and they had to take all the little pieces from the corner of their factory and put them on their sawmills one by one, and cut them into shape. And eventually they arrived here in the gallery, and the assembly part was quite easy. It took a few people and a few days, and it then ended up staying in front of the building after we had charred the outside and used some varnish on the inside. But what the manufacturer told us is that the process itself is so time-consuming for them that they would never continue with this. But the takeaway is if we can use leftover materials with zero waste, using this idea of using all of the material, why not design buildings with a zero waste mentality right from the beginning? So this is what we're now doing with the Slender building. We are developing a timber apartment building in Tallinn. Again, this uses our favorite grid system, which when building installation, we realized also has a spiral geometry embedded into it. So this created a spiral cascading of floor plates, which means we're not bound to the floor area anymore. We can actually extend one single apartment over many floors. And another thing that it allows for is is a little shift in the spiral, creating different floor heights. The load-bearing facade consists of diagonals in two directions, so it's a stiffening structure, and then in the end it's cladded with solar panels with pockets for gardening, etc. And we've been developing this also in a 8-story version, which is the highest possible at the moment in Estonia. And looking at the ways that the apartments inside could actually vary in size. None of the division walls are load-bearing, so you can remove them, add them, move them around, and possibly adapt to changes in how families grow, or as it's a rental building, you can shift things around. And tomorrow at Tallinn Architecture Biennale main exhibition opening, we will exhibit a one-to-one mock-up of this facade that actually allows you to go up on those ladders. That creates a secondary escape route, but it also creates what we call a dacha wrap. So there's less and less green space that people can actually use for gardening. So we're saying, why not bring it back on the facades of buildings and let people grow their crops. And this brings me to student work. I have timers, but they're just random numbers. I don't know what's going on. How much? 10 minutes over?
No, it's exactly.
Okay. So I'll just quickly go through this. In student work, we also try to ask students to develop their own elements, define their relationship, and what kind of structures emerge from these geometries that they create. This is the fall semester, and then in the spring semester they have to take what they learned to actually construct a building out of this. This was 2 years ago. We asked them to use this method to construct a chair. These were some of the outcomes. And last year we asked them to develop a geometric system for an abstract apartment building, and then the following semester actually design an apartment building. But the idea here was that it's a Baugruppen type of building, so that it's not developed by a big company, but rather the people that want to go and live there. So we were hoping this could also create more variation in what people actually want when they can design or start thinking of how they want to live in this building. And yeah, in our practice, we also use it for a small scale project, some private projects, but one of the most exciting projects for us in recent times is tunnels and bridges in Ülemiste in Tallinn, where this this large infrastructural node needs to somehow become inhabitable for humans, and we try to break down the scale with this modulation of the surfaces, bringing in timber and creating places to sit, and embedding stairs, etc. Yeah, that concludes this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We still have a short time for questions or comments.
Questions. One last one, just a short. When I'm going to do the geometrical joints to the panels, interlocking.
Well, with the bus stop, we did. Turns out screws are a lot easier to use than actual joints. Well, we're in the process. The Slender building project also includes four blacking out engineers. We have acoustics, fire safety, energy, and structure. So I think I showed there's some kind of idea of how those things could go together. So yeah, we're working on it.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask about the flat ontology. Are you also considering more complex ontologies in digitalization, or is it the principle to keep to this flat ontology only?
Well, I think it's just a powerful idea that the Raumstruktur, that is such a complex thing that is impossible to grasp. It's actually something that we modulate, that we design, where we choose which kinds of inputs we take and which we leave out. Which means that there's all of these elements, objects coming together that because they're digital and treated as being on a horizontal hierarchy, can be interchanged, and I think it allows for a lot of creative freedom as well, to kind of not only say that this is the geometric underlying structure that we use, now everything is built up on that, but actually the very basis of how you generate this geometry, how you construct everything, can be switched out, and all the other components still remain intact and can be reused. So I think there's a lot more modularity in its truest sense in the digital than there is actually in the real, so to say.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really like how your work's evolving. I saw it also in the first conference, and I'm fascinated how this geometrical investigations, how that arrives at new products. I really like the post for electricity, for instance. I think is fascinating. For me, it has a gentleness within its structure. But and I'm also fascinated by these explorations, and somehow for me, when it is spatial or is related to a kind of organization of space, both perhaps physical gravity, but also when there is a program in the housing, there is what Lars Spijbroek calls, there is a relation between gravity and grace. And graceness, I think, is also one of the aspects you can associate with gentleness. Where I myself start to doubt about the work is when it becomes ornament. So my question would be, and that I see in the tunnel, I understand it could happen, but there I have the feeling that it becomes more ornamental, so quite flat. Well, I think I said you said something very interesting, is the emergence of otherness, and that otherness starts you to investigate to what it is, to relate to it, and you become engaged. While I think in, for instance, the ceiling of the tunnel, it's ornamentation. So my question is, perhaps it's very interesting, what is your thought about ornamentation in relation to the emergence of otherness?
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Easy question.
Yeah, well, I see myself as a hybridist. I don't think I'm a purist computational brutalist. I like to see where those tools take us and how they start to create meaning. And I think ornament is very much connected to meaning and how we perceive things. And in a sense, well, those infrastructural projects, those very complex technologies and how you can create tunnels under intact railways that are constantly being used. And those structures have a very specific shape. It's a concrete box, basically, that is pushed under the rail tracks. So how do we create an inhabitable space in this kind of harshness of this technicality of the box? I think is an important question, but also how we then move people within the space, and how we attract attention to those nodes that are actually connectors that you have to be able to see from afar. In a way, it needs to be an oddball, otherwise it just kind of blends into its surroundings. And I think ornamentation, in that sense, it's an urban ornament. It's there to attract attention and to create those special moments that have a specific meaning.